you thought you knew how to rent a home, I'm about to tell you that in Italy, it's a completely different kettle of fish. I have been renting homes here now for 6 years, and I can tell you it is so different compared to how I used to rent property back in the UK. And so in today's video, I'm going to share with you what no one tells you about renting in Italy so that you can better prepare yourself. Now, if you're really interested in this topic, there are a couple of other videos I recommend that you watch. Watch this video right here to take you through the 4 stages that you go through when renting in Italy so that you can give yourself some kind of structure. And then watch this video after that, which will show you how you can find properties to rent in Italy and actually walk you through some of the websites that you can use and show you what to do. So they are 2 great videos in addition to this one, but without further ado, what are some things that no one tells you about when it comes to renting in Italy? Let's begin with the first, most important one of all, the condition of the home. Now, this is something that really took me by surprise when I moved to Italy, because coming from the UK, when you rent a property in the UK, you rent it in good condition, like you are ready to move in. There is a fitted kitchen suite, there is a fitted bathroom suite, you know, there are light fixtures. Everything is ready to go. You don't have to do very much, if at all, to prepare yourself for moving in. You've just got to unpack your stuff. That has always been my experience in the UK, and I know that I'm not alone. Here in Italy though, goodness me, you'll be very lucky if you have a similar experience, because the majority of homes that you rent here in Italy are empty shells. And this is the thing that really took me by surprise. Now, the first home that I rented in Salerno, I'll put a picture here, was actually furnished. We were really lucky. We got this modern, beautiful apartment that came fitted with furniture, but that was very rare. Again, it was through somebody we knew, always connections, it builds the trust. I'll talk more about that later. But essentially, that was a really rare find. It's super unusual to find properties that are furnished. Now, take the home that I'm currently in here in Palermo, and this was an empty shell. We were super lucky because the owners of this home decided to repaint the entire home before we moved in, because it was really dated and old. But again, we kind of knew the people who rented this property to us through the different connections we have. And so, you know, again, we were really lucky about that, because I honestly think if we'd been somebody from outside of this circle, we may not have had the same experience, you know? So yeah, this is it, empty shells. You are very lucky if you find a kitchen suite. And when I'm in kitchen suite, I mean the full shebang. Cupboard, sink, oven, the works. You are really lucky if you find that fitted in your home. When we moved in, we did not have a kitchen here. We had to buy a kitchen and have it fitted. And this is exactly how it works here in Italy. People actually move homes with their kitchen suites. It's considered to be like a piece of furniture. It's quite incredible. So that's the first thing you've got to consider, because it's quite an expense you've got to start laying out money for from the very beginning when you think you've got to actually fit a kitchen in your home to be able to rent it. The second thing you've got to think about as well is just the general condition of the home itself. Now, as I said to you, we were really lucky in this home in Palermo in the sense that they repainted the walls. That isn't necessarily the case. Normally what you find when you move in is what you have to deal with. So that normally means that if you want to repaint things and you're able to, that responsibility falls on your shoulders, even though it isn't your home. Now, tied into that is the cleanliness of the home that you're going to move into. In the UK, it's very normal to have a pre-tenancy clean done on the property that you move into, so that it's spick and span on the day of moving. But in Italy, it isn't the case. It took us an entire week to clean this home before it was ready for us to move our belongings into. And trust me, that is something that, gosh, well, I wasn't ready for, because I was ready to have a home that was at least clean enough for me to move my stuff into. So you've got to be prepared for this. The condition of the homes are not always fantastic. And you know, you've got to get clear on your expectations and understand that homes here are shells, and essentially you're not necessarily going to have all your creature comforts fitted when you actually sign the lease to rent your property. Now, the second thing that no one really talks about is the contract itself. You've got to be really careful with the rental contracts here in Italy, especially if your residency and your visa status depends on this. Now, one thing you need to be aware of is that there are different contract types in Italy. You can have a transitory contract, which is typically a short-term contract, usually for maybe a couple of months or up to a year maximum. And this type of contract is often issued for homes that are either shared residences, where you have more than one person living in the same place with different contracts, or, for example, Airbnb homes that are rented out in low season often issue these types of contracts because you cannot stay there on a long-term basis. What you have to be careful with is those types of contract do not offer you residency. So as I said before, a lot of visa applications will require you to be resident here in Italy and to have a place of residence. And so for this, you are not going to be able to register your residency against a transitory contract unless the landlord gives you permission to do so. Now, I had a transitory contract back in Salerno in the second home that I lived in, and my landlord did allow me to register my residency against it, but this is not normal. And so you do have to be really, really careful about that, because it can affect your residency status if you are not able to use the contract to show where you live. Now, the other form of contracts are more the long-term contracts, and these can vary. They are typically like 4x4, 3x2, and what this means is, if we take the 3x2 contract, for example, you have the home for a period of 3 years at the rent that is set and signed for at the time of completing the contract. You are then able, at the end of the 3 years, provided you or the landlord do not want to change anything, to renew that contract for another 2 years, always with the same rent and always with the same conditions in place. So essentially what this means is, provided there are no changes, you could potentially rent a home here for anything from 5 years to 8 years without any changes in place. Now, I will say, I think this is fantastic, particularly because the rents in London especially are sky high, and usually every year or every few months the rents are increasing, and if people have like a yearly contract, unfortunately at the end of that year, 9 times out of 10 they're going to get a rent increase. So to have your rent capped for a period of up to 5 years or up to 8 years is actually a really, really good thing, especially in these uncertain economic times. So I think that is a huge plus point, but it does also mean you have to be super sure about the home that you move into, because generally speaking, the break clause notice periods for these types of contract can be as long as 6 months. So you really do have to be sure about where you choose to move to, because these types of contracts do tie you into the property for quite some time. Now, when it comes to the deposit that you have to pay to secure your contract, this can vary, and it really depends whether or not you have a private landlord or you are going through an agency, like an estate agency, for example. Now, the thing you have to be aware of is that typically the deposits can vary. Usually it's at least a 2-month minimum deposit. One of those months will be the deposit month, and the other month will be your first month's rent up front. Now, some companies will charge you a 3-month deposit minimum, and sometimes, especially with the agencies, that third payment that you pay is just their fees. You don't get that back at the end of your contract. So it can be quite expensive at the very beginning when you're renting here, because there's a lot you need to pay for up front. Now, don't get me wrong, the deposits are equally as high in the UK. You do have to put quite a bit of money down initially, depending on the property you rent. But it is worth noting that there is quite a high fee for agency fees here, and it typically tends to be the equivalent of the rent that you will pay on the home is going to be what you give to the estate agents for their work in terms of showing you the property. So be aware of that and be prepared for it. When it comes to other hidden costs that no one tells you about, condominium fees. Now, if your home is in a building with other apartments, then normally you will have a condominium fee to pay. And what this is every household will pay a percentage towards the maintenance, the cleaning and upkeep of the building and the grounds, if there are any. And this cost varies considerably. It depends if you have a portiera or caretaker, or if you have just, self-management, like companies just come in and clean it. There's not somebody on site all the time. but it can add up. Like an average amount of a condominium bill could be as much as €100 per month, depending on the building, depending on the work that's done, and depending on the facilities that you have as well. So again, that's an extra cost that you've got to factor in addition to your rent that is not in your contract. So you do need to be aware of this at the time of looking at properties, what the cost of the condominium is going to be, because that is an additional cost that becomes your responsibility to pay. Now, tied into that is to make sure that absolutely everything is in writing. This is one of the biggest things that we made a huge mistake with, because we kind of knew the people who rented this home here in Palermo. We took their word as gospel without getting it written down, and unfortunately it meant that when it came to signing the contract, some of the things that had been promised to us as being part of the home were not included, and we didn't really have a leg to stand on because we didn't have anything in writing. So for this reason, everything must be in writing, okay? Absolutely everything. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist, okay? So everything needs to be in writing in your contract. It's really important that you have your contract translated, especially if you don't speak Italian very well. Contracts here can be very complicated, very detailed and in depth, and you need to understand your responsibilities, which is the next thing that no one tells you about when it comes to renting here, is that your responsibilities as a tenant here are far greater than in other countries. So typically, like in the UK, if something goes wrong in your home, you have some, I don't know, the boiler stops working, or there's some kind of minor issue, the landlord is generally responsible for maintenance, or the agency, depending on who looks after your property. Here in Italy, a lot of time that responsibility falls on the tenants, depending on the work that needs to be done. And so you end up paying for something as if this were your actual home, when really you are just a tenant. So that is where you have to be careful, because that will be stipulated in your contract, which is why you need to make sure you really understand your responsibilities here. They go far beyond the responsibilities of tenants in other countries. And so you really need to understand, if something goes wrong in your home, who is footing the bill, who is responsible for that. And if it's not written down, you need to get it included in the contract, because otherwise you're going to have a headache much later on when you're trying to sort out who's going to pay for what. You also have what is known as the tarry here, which is like the rubbish tax. This is managed better in some regions of Italy compared to others. Here in Palermo, it's a complete mess, because what is supposed to happen is that the residency office, when you register your residency, are supposed to automatically contact the office that manage the rubbish tax, and then they are supposed to send you a bill. But trust me, that doesn't happen, and the next available in-presence appointment at the rubbish tax office is next year. So it's a problem. So you do have to be aware of how your particular region and city manages it. Salerno was super efficient. You could not register your residency in Salerno until you had registered yourself with the rubbish tax office. When you had that receipt to say that you were registered with the rubbish tax office, you could go and register your residency in Salerno. And I think that's the better option, because this tax is mandatory, it's compulsory, everybody needs to pay it. And allegedly there are supposed to be quite severe penalties if you don't. But it is surprising how many people evade the system, particularly here in Palermo, and don't pay it, or at least rack up a lot of arrears before they do end up paying it. So I think a system where you have to actually register first with your rental contract before you can register your residency is the best way, because everybody needs to be resident in Italy. You must have a place of residency in Italy. And so this almost guarantees that you're going to register for the rubbish tax, because without it, you can't claim your home here. So I think that's a much better way of doing it, but you do need to understand how your particular region manages this. It's a very, very important tax that you must pay. And a lot of Italian people will say it's expensive, but coming from London, I can tell you it's actually reasonable compared to what you pay for council tax, which I guess would be the equivalent tax in the UK. Because council tax in the UK is dependent on your bands, which is dependent on the size of your house and where you live. And oh my goodness, it can be super expensive, like literally over £1,000 minimum sometimes. So for this, I feel like the cost here As I've said, it really does depend on the size of your home and where you are, but the cost here can be a few €100, but it's nowhere near as much as it is in the UK. So for me personally, I think it's cheaper, but for a lot of Italian people, they will tell you it's pretty expensive to pay this. Now, the next thing that I don't think a lot of people will tell you about renting in Italy is it actually can be quite difficult to rent a home here, particularly if you are a foreigner. Now, it's not because Italian people have a problem against foreigners. I see this sometimes in different videos, you know, Italian people are against foreigners renting homes and they make my life really difficult. I'm not discrediting the experiences that some of you have had, because I know that some of you have found it extremely difficult to rent a property here in Italy coming from another country. However, I will say to you that there is a bit of a history here in Italy of landlords being ripped off by tenants, in the sense that they go through the procedure, they sign all the documents, and then the tenant suddenly stops paying the rent. And it is an extremely lengthy and expensive process to evict the tenant from the home, especially if they have children. If they have children, goodness, it's almost like a protection for them, and this process can drag on for months, maybe even years. And this is why landlords here especially are very nervous about who they rent their homes to, because they know if they make a mistake, it could be very costly to them and cause them a lot of problems and headaches later on. So it's nothing personal. As much as I feel like sometimes it can be that way, I promise you it's nothing personal. Like, it is just the experiences that people have had here and the way that the system is set up. It doesn't always protect landlords in the way that it should. So, you know, for this reason, they are a lot more strict when it comes to references and kind of knowing a bit more about you, what you're working as, you know, making sure that you've got the means to be able to pay for your rent, etc. So yeah, do consider this, because there have been historically a lot of problems here concerning landlords and tenants that refuse to pay. So I think this is a big reason why it can be quite tricky sometimes to rent here, and why you may not always get as welcome a reception as you had hoped. And another thing that I want to talk about is that, of course, the price that you pay for renting a property here is really going to depend where in Italy you're interested in. Salerno predominantly was considered to be a more expensive southern Italian city, and so, for example, the home that I rented there was a lot more expensive than what I pay for the property here in Palermo, and it was smaller. So you've got to consider this. Milan is a super expensive city to rent places in, and various other places, popular destinations across Italy, are going to be more expensive to rent properties in. So do your homework and really understand where your budget can take you in Italy, because it really does vary from one region to the next, and it really does depend on whereabouts in that region you decide to base yourself. Obviously, the closer you are to the city centre, to good transport connections, the more expensive it's going to be for you. But you need to do your research, and you need to decide like what you can honestly afford to pay, factoring in all your other living expenses that you're going to have here as well. So I think ultimately renting here, it can on the one hand be a really good way to set yourself up here. I think a lot of people move here and think they must immediately buy a place. I kind of think that's a real long-term investment that you're making, and you need to be sure, in my opinion, that Italy is the country you want to make that kind of investment in. It's not to say that Italy is a terrible country. I love it. I've been living here for 6 years and I'm so happy that I do, but it's not an easy country to live in, and it may not be the best country for you once you really start spending a significant amount of time here. And so I think sometimes to begin your journey here, renting can actually be a really clever thing to do, because you get to understand what it's like to even live in a particular part of Italy before you actually make a long-term commitment by buying somewhere here. So I would suggest that renting can be a good starting opportunity for you here, and once you are set up and you are able to rent somewhere here with good references and, you know, a stable job and the ability to demonstrate your income depending on your situation, you do have a sense of security. And especially with the long-term rental contracts, if you're able to secure one of those, that definitely makes you feel a lot more at ease, because as you know from so many of my videos, the bureaucracy here is an absolute nightmare. So anything that can take that stress away and give you a sense of peace for a period of time is very welcome, in my opinion. So if you enjoyed this video, why not watch this video next, where I actually take you inside my Italian home so you can see parts of my home and just what it's like to have a property here in South Italy, and I will see you in the next video.